Covalent bonds can result in something known as polarity, and polarity results from an unequal sharing of electrons. Polarity occurs when you have a very electronegative atom sharing electrons with atoms that are not very electronegative. So what is electronegativity? Well, this refers to an atom's ability to attract electrons very strongly. Certain atoms are more electronegative than others. Fluorine, for instance, is very electronegative. It really attracts electrons strongly to it. Hydrogen, on the other hand, is not very electronegative. In general, the larger an atom is, the more electronegative it is, although there are exceptions to that. When we have a very electronegative atom sharing with an atom that is not very electronegative, we end up with something known as a polar molecule. Polar molecules have charges. So let's take a look at that. Water is a great example of a polar molecule. Here we have an oxygen atom that's big and very electronegative, sharing with two little hydrogens that are small and not very electronegative. Now what that means is that even though the electrons that are being shared here can zoom around both nuclei, they're actually going to spend most of their time around that oxygen. Because the oxygen is very electronegative, it's going to hog those electrons. Now what does this mean in terms of charges? Well, because electrons are negative and because they're hanging out around this nucleus, it's going to give that oxygen atom a negative charge, a partial negative charge. The hydrogens, on the other hand, are sort of deprived of these electrons, and because the electrons are negative, those hydrogens are going to end up with a slight positive charge. So polar molecules do not share electrons equally, and they have slight charges. So how do you know by looking at a molecule whether it's polar or not? Well, there are a couple of tricks to this. One thing you want to look at is how lopsided that molecule is. If you have a really, really big atom sharing a covalent bond with a little bitty atom, it's probably lopsided electrically. It's probably going to be polar. Another thing you can do is to look at the periodic table. Electronegativity tends to increase as you go from left to right on the periodic table and also from top to bottom. So if you have a little bitty atom way over here on the left sharing with a larger atom over here on the right, you probably have a polar molecule. For our purposes, the most electronegative atoms are the ones shown in the red boxes here. So nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and chlorine. If you have other atoms attached to those, you've probably got a polar molecule. Here's an example of a polar and a nonpolar molecule. Over here on the left, we have ammonia. Now ammonia has this big old nitrogen sharing with three little bitty hydrogens. The nitrogen is going to hog those electrons most of the time, so it will have a slight negative charge, and the hydrogens will have a slight positive charge. That's a polar molecule. It contains polar covalent bonds. On the right, we have a nonpolar molecule, methane or CH4. This is a carbon which is larger than hydrogens, and it is sharing with four hydrogens. But because they are distributed around that carbon pretty equally, and because carbon isn't particularly electronegative, they're going to share the electrons pretty evenly. So we would call this a nonpolar molecule, or we would say it contains nonpolar covalent bonds. I'd like you to practice determining whether a molecule is polar or nonpolar, and you can complete this your turn by looking at your guided notes. What I want you to do is to look at each of these molecules and determine if they are polar or nonpolar based on their shape, also based on the differences in electronegativity that you see on the periodic table. So give it a try. Over here on the left we have CO2, on the right we've got water, and there are a couple of more on the next slide. Here's the rest of that your turn. On the left over here, you've got oxygen gas, or O2. On the right, you've got HCl, or hydrochloric acid. Determine whether these are polar or nonpolar and write it down on your guided notes. Bring it to class with you. All right, so we've been talking and talking about this polarity stuff. Why do we care about that? Well, it turns out that when you put two polar molecules together, they can form a new kind of bond with each other. And we call this kind of bond hydrogen bonds. These bonds often form between the hydrogen of one of the molecules and a different atom of another kind of molecule. Here we have a hydrogen bond forming between a water molecule and a molecule of ammonia. Now, in a water molecule, the hydrogens have a slight positive charge. In ammonia, this nitrogen has a slight negative charge. So remember what Paula Abdul taught us, opposites attract. That partial positive, and that's what that little symbol means, is partial, is going to be attracted to this partial negative down here, and so they are attracted. We represent the hydrogen bond with a dotted line, and that's because it's actually a very, very weak little bond. So dotted lines mean hydrogen bonds. Because water molecules are so lopsided, they really readily form hydrogen bonds. Here we have a group of water molecules, and you can see all the little bonds forming between them, between those negative and positive parts of different atoms. All these little dotted lines in here. Hydrogen bonding is what allows water to form into droplets and to soak into paper towels and to do almost all of the really cool things that water does. We'll talk about this more in Chapter 3.